G'day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a new Warframe guide. And this will be a remake guide, where we go back, grab an old video I did by the scruff of the neck, shake it around a little bit, throw some fancy decorations on it, and push it out back onto the walkway for all to see. This is the Valkyr 2.0 guide. Oh Valkyr, where would the game be without this wonderful girl? With more Tenogen skins than you can shake a stick at, not only does this lovely girl offer enough fashion frame potential to quell even the most intensively end-game dedicated player, but she also has an unbelievable level of power. Valkyr has a hatred for life. Having been tortured by Alad V, she now only wants to sate her bloodlust by destroying anything that stands before her. With probably one of the more interesting backstories, even having her own cinematic when Alad V was originally released, basically dedicated entirely to her badassery and maybe some other Tenno that were trying to maybe rescue her from being strapped up by Alad's weirdness. Valkyr has a huge base health pool and a massive amount of base armor as well, which you can play off with your builds later down the line. And assuming you're building correctly, Valkyr can become an unkillable force of nature. I think it's also worth mentioning that although there is some technical prowess needed to get the biggest potency out of her, Valkyr is a frame that is extremely good for a new player, because she can be nigh on invincible, and much like Excalibur has an exalted weapon with her claws that can destroy enemies far beyond the level you'd think you'd be capable of in the early stages of getting into Warframe. She is a good stepping stone to move on from the more early game frames which are new player friendly. So for example, if you've maybe picked up Rhino and you figured you want to take off the safety wheels and maybe have a frame that can be great for survivability, but also start reaching the deeper intricacies of what Warframes have to offer, Valkyr offers all of that and more, along with a quick, fast-paced, destructive playstyle. In terms of playstyle, Valkyr has a wide array of abilities and builds that allow for some very fun playstyles. Destructive playstyles, preservative playstyles, it's all personal preference. For me personally, I have one of two ways I'll play Valkyr. The first of these playstyles is based around her Hysteria. Focusing on max efficiency and power strength, you engage into a bloody frenzy where so long as you have energy, you are pretty much unkillable. Relying on Hysteria is also a great way for new players to get to grips with Valkyr, as even with lackluster modding, she gets the offer of huge amounts of damage with good survivability, which is great because I'm sure a lot of us, if not all of us, have had a time when we first get into the game where our weapons are just not cutting it, or either because you don't have the modding or through it just wasn't up to snuff for the level you were fighting at. I found a Hysteria-focused build, even unmodded, can blast through the star chart without too much of an issue. And much like Rhino's Iron Skin, acts as a good fallback mechanic if you ever get into a situation where you think, "Oh, shiz, man, I'm gonna die." This playstyle isn't limited to new player-friendly antics either. There are also a massive depth of builds that can take it from something you only use once in a while to then something that ends up lasting indefinitely and can shred level 100 ambulances with absolutely no issue. The only thing this build lacks, especially for builds that haven't quite reached the peak, is you are pretty much a one-trick pony. With Hysteria, you won't likely use your other abilities all that much, for risk of letting your Hysteria fall off. The second playstyle is a bit more technical and requires a deeper understanding of her modding and abilities, but I would like to throw it out there as this type of Valkyr play is super satisfying, and that is the playstyle that relies on her Warcry. And combining that with her Eternal War augment, this essentially gives you and your allies a huge buff of damage and survivability that is pretty much unmatched with almost any frame. Now initially, you may think, that's not tough, but this is where it gets interesting. In theory, you could stop there and just have a support type Valkyr with the buff you give to your allies, but with the right build and weapon, this can then become an unstoppable whirling dervish of destruction. Using Warcry gives you a huge amount of attack speed, and combining that with a status-based weapon that's very fast, like Legion, which also has a built-in attack speed boost, and guaranteed status procs, you can then combine that with the mods that you end up modding for, and mods like Healing Returns, to not only generate an absurd level of self-healing, but an attack speed that is almost impossible for your fingers to keep up with. This kind of play does require a level of build prowess that a lot of new players won't fully understand, but at the very least, it is something that can be aimed for, and I'd highly advise giving it a go, because unlike Hysteria, this type of Valkyr can then also add in things like Hysteria to the mix with her other abilities on top of that. And this is one of those builds that has an absurdly high cap of damage if you play it right. So I guess the way to look at this is playstyle 1 is new player friendly and simple. Playstyle 2 with Eternal War is a bit more technical and harder to master, but has a lot more potency. But both of them, regardless of what you do with them, are gonna absolutely kick some mighty Valkyr booty. Now, where does one get Valkyr from? Thankfully, it's super early in the game, and is kind of why she's very useful for new players, because she is not exactly the earliest frame you'll come into contact with, but it's one you'll find quite quickly as you make your way around the star chart. Valkyr is obtained from Jupiter, from Themisto, on the Alad V encounter. Probably one of the tougher fights for a new player who's just picked up the game, but with some understanding of the mechanics, Alad V won't really pose too much of an issue for you, and can be blasted through quite quickly, especially if you have a couple of people who know what they're doing. The chassis and the neuroptics both have a drop chance of 38.72%, and the systems have a drop chance of 22.56%. The actual blueprint for Valkyr is from the marketplace as well, so keep that in mind. A fully crafted regular Valkyr at level 30 will come in with 300 health, 150 shields, and get this, 600 armor! Quite possibly one of the highest base armor values of any normal frame in the game. She also comes with 150 energy, a 1.1 sprint speed, and 2 Madurai polarities. The Prime variant then has 300 health, 150 shields, an upgrade of 100 armor with 700 total, 225 energy, a 1.1 run speed, an extra Madurai polarity in the regular polarities, giving you 3 total now, and then a Madurai polarity in the aura slot as well. Valkyr's one is called Ripline. Ripline is basically a hookshot type ability, which can latch onto walls, ceilings, pretty much anything really, and pull Valkyr in the direction she hookshots onto. Or you can be an absolute meanie and tug around enemies and bully them like the bloodlusted bully you are. In short, this ability is more for mobility than anything else, but you can be nice. You can have some nice knockdown. It can be nice to knock down some bigger units like Noxes, for example. The Ripline has an initial range of 75 meters. It will deal 600 damage to the initial target it hits, and this is the interesting part. The damage you deal on the initial cast is set. If you then cast it again within a second of the initial cast, you gain a 200% damage boost, and the energy cost is then reduced by 50%. Doing it again within a second cast time increases it by a total of 400% and an energy reduction of 75%. So it can do some damage, most certainly, but it's not something you'll likely be using over, say, your Hysteria or your Eternal War. But it's nice to make you feel like you're Spider Valkyr, being able to jump all over the place like Spider-Man doing his web-slinging thing. Now, the range of this ability is dictated by your ability range, and the damage you deal on the initial impact of your tug is based on power strength. The effectiveness of the ragdoll is also then somewhat affected by the power strength as well, and the ragdoll is only just a typical ragdoll that the enemy will get up right afterwards. There's no stun duration here. The augment for this ability is pretty much pointless. I was actually almost contemplating not even putting it in, but it's called Swing Line. Swing Line allows the 4 next casts after your initial cast of Ripline to cost 0 mana. So you cast 1 Swing Line, and then the next 4 will cost nada. So you can embody the inner Spider-Man that you've always wanted to embody. Valkyr's 2 is called Warcry. Valkyr's 2 is called Warcry. Valkyr's 2 is, as mentioned earlier, one of the fundamental abilities based around one of her playstyles. I'd really advise giving this a test, as it is one of the pivotal abilities in the game, and it's probably one of the stronger buffs in the game as well. Valkyr will essentially scream out like she's at a Screamo concert, buff herself and her allies within range, and adversely debuff enemies within range. Enemies will have their attack speed slowed by 30% for 15 seconds, as well as also their attack speed and everything else. On the other hand, the buff to your allies and yourself will gain a 50% attack buff, a 50% attack speed buff, a 50% armor buff for 15 seconds. Really, the only downside of this ability is its initially very short duration time, but there's an augment that we'll be talking about in a moment that can help you with that as well. Because most of your builds rely on power strength, you'll end up getting a much more potent buff than the baseline stats you initially start with. So you'll quickly see how powerful this can make you in almost any of your playstyles. If the energy is there, you'll want to use this to amp up your damage and improve survivability. Using this with faster weapons is my personal preference, and because of this buff is additive, it'll even stack with things like Berserker and Fury. The buff duration and the debuff duration are affected by your power duration. The potency of said buff and debuff are also affected by power strength, and the range of said buff is also affected by range. Not that you are really ever going to mod for range unless you fancy using your rip line like Spider-Man. The augment for this ability is called Eternal War and is the bread and butter of a Warcry build. Eternal War helps you counter the low amount of duration you'll initially have with this. While Warcry is active, killing enemies will increase the duration of the buff by 2 seconds, so long as the kill is made with a melee weapon. Modding duration also increases the amount of time per enemy killed, and the amount of time they will give you on your buff. This really synergizes well with Valkyr as it plays to the idea of you wanting to murder everything. The more you kill, the longer the buff lasts. The longer the buff lasts, the more you kill. And as you can see by how we're just tearing through these level 155 Lancers, there's a lot of potency here. So, maybe Warcry should be something you should test out. Maybe, possibly, maybe. Take a look at it. Valkyr's 3 is called Paralysis. You know what? I've struggled so many times saying this. I'm just going to go with Paralysis. Probably one of the most underused abilities Valkyr has. Paralysis causes Valkyr to sacrifice her shields, stunning and dealing damage based on the amount of shields you sacrifice. The amount of shields you sacrifice has then a multiplier of 350%. The damage is then dealt as impact damage, so I guess this means you want to mod for shields to make this more potent? But I mean, who mods for shields these days? Unless you name children. This will basically be a oh crap moment kind of ability where you maybe need to revive your allies, or maybe this as a location taking damage, or maybe you're just bored and want to terrify the Grineer soldiers by making them witness what it's like to be at a Justin Bieber concert. Yeah, I think that'd be enough to stun anyone. The actual duration of the stun, it's only about 1 second long, and it's actually just a typical stagger. So there's no effectiveness from modding for duration with this. It's just a passive stagger. However, the range in which this affects is affected by your ability range. And again, you're not modding for range, so you're probably not going to see too much use of this in the grand scheme of things. The augment for Paralysis is called Prolonged Paralysis. So this augment is actually kind of cool. Affected enemies are basically dragged towards Valkyr, and the stun duration is increased by 200%. So for whatever reason, if you do decide to use this ability, Prolonged Paralysis is kind of cool. This augment can actually up your potency with Paralysis to a huge margin. Like, this actually makes this stun a formidable crowd control. And it's also kind of funny to watch the enemies being drawn into Valkyr as if they're about ready, they know they're about ready to die. The stun is actually very potent, and it does slow them down quite tremendously as well. If you do then mod for duration, the length of this stun is also then extended as well. If you ever fancy playing a Valkyr as support, I would actually consider giving this a shot. The augment makes this into something that's actually viable to use for a defensive type mission, or even just like for the purpose of crowd control, you know? You can see how good it is, and having that up, it's actually very similar to a Rhino's stomp in that regard, in the sort of effect it makes them, where they're then locked into that animation of falling on the ground very slowly. So you can stab in the butt. Now it's the bread and butter, the coup de grace, the ultimate, Hysteria! Kind of like the Muse song. Although, unlike the Muse song, this is actually quite deadly. This is the bread and butter and the most used ability for Valkyr. Hysteria puts Valkyr into a frenzy and activates her exalted weapons and gains a few interesting perks while active. These perks are as follows. Dealing damage will deal 250 damage in an AoE format to enemies within a 2 meter radius. The damage dealt is split evenly between impact, puncture, and slash damage. Wall attacks, slide attacks will inflict 750 bonus damage as well. Aerial attacks inflict 500 damage, and slam attacks inflict a bonus 300 damage in a 5-meter radius, like thus. Now, there's a slight complicated element to this Hysteria. There's some fundamentals that's worth noting, however, you don't need to know these, but for the sake of a guide, I think it's worth mentioning. You gain some multipliers whilst in Hysteria. Your attacks have a 200% crit damage multiplier, with a 50% crit chance addition, and then a bonus 10% status chance whilst in Hysteria. Additionally, Valkyr is healed for 5% of the total melee damage she inflicts, which adds a lovely element of sustain. The damage she deals is also affected by ability strength and the combo meter. So for almost all mods in the game, you will gain a benefit towards Hysteria. For example, having pressure point, and all that sort of stuff. Things like Blood Rush, things that have multipliers on the mod itself generally don't affect Hysteria. Now, there's some synergy here with certain weapons. For example, you will gain a benefit from your combo multiplier. So if you've equipped Venka Prime, for example, then you will gain the benefit of the combo counter going up from the passive of Venka, which will then, you will see a big impact on the way your damage is dealt through that multiplier with Hysteria. While Hysteria is active, Valkyr becomes immune to all damage and status effects. That's right, she is basically immortal, which is why you want to keep this up at all given times. Whilst this is active, Valkyr emits an aura with a radius of 5 meters around her, and 30% of the total damage she ignores is stored. If any enemy within this aura have line of sight of Valkyr, when Hysteria is deactivated, Valkyr will be dealt 25% of all stored damage as impact damage to herself. So you do have to be careful when you deactivate this that you don't accidentally gib yourself. This is probably one of the main uses and one of the most useful parts of Hysteria because it does pretty much make you immortal, unless you run out of energy, at which point you might die. But the damage, the potency, the invulnerability makes a new player experience using Hysteria very, very good, as it will allow you to pretty much walk around unhindered whilst dealing a crud ton of damage and generally just not dying at all. This is why Hysteria and Valkyr are such a great frame for being able to boost through content that you might have been otherwise stuck with. The augment for this ability, unlike the actual ability itself, it's a bit weird. It's not quite as useful, but it's kind of funny. So, whereas the Hysteria itself is super strong, super powerful, and everything of that nature, the augment, it's more of a gimmick. Basically, Hysterical Assault allows you to jump on an enemy's face and ravage them senseless and cover large areas. So, for example, you activate your Hysteria, and you use your attack button, you will then traverse a large area, generally 40 meters, depending on your build, and yeah, the enemy then gets a large amount of Valkyr butt in their face, and then you can sort of tear them a new one. It's a bit of a gimmick. If you fancy putting it on, I like this for the sheer sake of the novelty of being able to literally jump on your enemy's face and heel kick them. But really, it's not something you're going to see much use of other than for the novelty of it. And last but not least, oh boy, this has been a long video. But last but not least, the modding segment. Now, as always with these modding segments, I would like to emphasize that the modding should always be down to your preference. Take inspiration and use your own initiative as to how you mod. We're going to look at 2 specific builds for both Eternal War and the Hysteria builds. And then I'm going to show you a more beginners-friendly build. But again, use your initiative. Do the sort of builds that you think would work. Don't take this as gospel. This is only what I find worked for myself. Now, the first build is a Eternal War build. As always, the aura mod is entirely down to what you want to use. I personally find Steel Charge to be very good because melee damage is going to always be beneficial. Physique can also be a good option as well, as that's bonus health. And with Eternal War, you're going to have a lot of mitigation. More health, more mitigation. As for the rest of the mods, you are making a big priority towards power strength. Using Blind Rage and then Power Drift is a good option. You could possibly swap that out with Rush as well. That is a viable option as well for that extra movement to get between enemies. But you definitely want a good chunk of power strength to make sure that the buffs you gain from Eternal War are potent. Now, you don't need a massive amount of efficiency with this, because the idea is with an Eternal War build is Eternal War is going to help keep Warcry active. Therefore, you're not going to be casting your abilities so sporadically that you're going to always be out of energy. So having Blind Rage with the minus efficiency is not the worst thing on the planet. Combining that with the fact you may even use Streamline and then Hunter Adrenaline to have a constant flow of more energy coming in, chances are by the time your first Warcry wears off, you're gonna have enough energy to then cast it again. Now, keeping that in mind as well, you then have Prime Continuity for making up for some extra duration on there to increase the duration of each tick of Eternal War when you generate that extra duration with Eternal War. And then everything else therein, with Vitality, Gladiator Aegis, and Steel Fiber, is based around upping the overall stats you have to make the buff even stronger. And again, any survivability mods comes down to personal preference. I personally like using Vitality with as much armor as possible to help synergize with how much base armor she has from the word go. This could essentially be even Gladiator, the health mod that you get from the Gladiator set as well, which is quite nice. And the second build is for Hysteria. Now, this one's a little bit more straightforward. You're taking a bit of a preference away from power strength because you get most of your damage potency from the modding of your exalted weapon, along with the synergy between your build and then your weapons you have modded. And what we have here is power strength from Intensify and Transient Fortitude. And we then make up for that loss of duration with Prime Continuity and Narrow-Minded. We don't need range, so Narrow-Minded is a good choice. We then use Prime Flow or Regular Flow to have a larger energy pool, to try and have a larger pool to draw from to keep us in Hysteria longer. The purpose of a build for Hysteria is to keep you in Hysteria for as long as possible, and to basically not run out of energy. Now, if you don't have other ways of keeping your energy up, or you feel like your Hysteria is running out too quickly, you can, in theory, remove things like Steel Fiber. You can even get rid of a bit of power strength from Transient Fortitude to gain back that duration, and replace it with either Streamline or maybe Augur Message to get bonus duration to help improve the efficiency of staying in your Hysteria mode. These builds, both the Eternal War and Hysteria builds, these are the sort of peak that you are looking to achieve. A good Hysteria and a good Eternal War build will take about 2 or 3 Forma to get to. A perfect build, generally speaking, will take about 4 to 5. I would say that there is 1 extra Forma in here that wasn't needed, so you're looking at about 4 Forma. And you'll notice the improvement in damage and potency of these builds as you put Forma into them. It's very, very transparent how good these end up becoming. But the great thing with the Hysteria build is even with 0 Forma, Hysteria is going to absolutely destroy enemies and help you push through the star chart, which is why Hysteria is usually the go-to when you're picking up Valkyr. And no guide that we do is complete without a newer player-friendly build. We always try to do these builds to show how, with the more easily obtainable mods, you can still get a very simplified build that would be more achievable by newer players. Obviously, you may not have them at the same level, but it's something you can aim for. Going simply with Vitality, Steel Fiber to get that survivability, along with Gladiator Resolve. You then have Power Strength to help boost your Hysteria from Augur Secrets and Intensify, a bit of duration from Continuity, and the efficiency from Streamline. Honestly, the hardest mod in this build, this newer player-friendly build, would be Augur Secrets, but it is still quite easily obtainable so if you get a bit of luck in the early stage of the game. This could, in theory, be replaced with anything or whatever you feel is comfortable for you. But this is definitely obtainable for most players within the first couple of weeks of playing the game. And last but not least, we're going to have a little quick look over the modding for the Valkyr's Talons. Now, you have a unique stance with this, and that will just naturally level up as you level up the Talons themselves. In terms of what you're modding here, you are modding for as much raw damage as possible. Bear in mind, you do get benefits from certain mods, such as Condition Overload and the set bonus of things like the Gladiator set, for example. Generally speaking, you'll pick an element you want to focus on. For example, I personally like doing Corrosive or Viral, and then you'll try and get as much damage on there as possible. A lot of the time, you're going to try and prioritize crit damage because you already gain a huge crit benefit from being in Hysteria. So Organ Shatter, True Steel are a go-to. I do not believe that Blood Rush affects this as it stands, as of this video. However, if somebody finds out it does, then please let me know in the comments below and I'll correct it later down the line. But this is a generalized build for Hysteria. It works wonders, it does a huge amount of damage, and it's very, very potent. And that is the Redux Valkyr guide. Hopefully this has been an improvement over the one we did all those months ago. I have seen a great improvement in the way these guides have been done, especially now that we're running on a dual PC setup. I hope you guys have noticed the difference too. I would love to know what your opinions are on how we're producing these, and whether you have comments and feedback as to ways we can improve them further. If you think there's something that needs to be added, maybe taken away, maybe I'm guffing too much about things, I am very open to criticism. Just don't leave comments going, "Gah, it's bad," because that doesn't help anyone. Either way, hopefully you've enjoyed this video. Leave a like, share it to your friends, maybe subscribe if you're feeling generous, and I'll see all of you top hatters in the next video. Ta-ra!